Persuasion by Jane Austen. Chapter 13. The remainder of Anne's time in Uppercross, comprehending only 2 days, was spent entirely at the mansion house, and had satisfaction of knowing herself extremely useful there, both as an immediate companion and as assisting in all those arrangements for the future, which those in Mr. and Mrs. Mungrove's distressed states of spirits would have been difficulties. And there had been an early count from Lyme the next morning. Louisa was much the same. No symptoms worse than before had appeared. Charles came a few hours afterwards to bring a later and more particular account. He was tolerably cheerful. A speedy cure must not be hoped, but everything was going well as the nature of the case admitted. In speaking of the Harvilles, he seemed unable to satisfy his own sense of their kindness, especially to Mrs. Harville's exertion as a nurse. She really had left nothing for Mary to do. He and Mary had been persuaded to go there early at the inn last night. Mary had been hysterical again the next morning, and when he came, he was to walk out with Captain Benwick, which he hoped, and would do her good. He would almost wished he had been prevailed on one of them to come home the day before, and the truth was that Mrs. Harville left nothing for anybody to do. Charles was to return at Lyme the same afternoon, but his father had first half a mind to go with him, but the ladies could not consent. It would be going only to multiply trouble to the others, and to increase his own distress. A much better scheme had followed upon what was acted, and a chaise was sent for the Crewkerne, and Charles conveyed far back more useful person in the old nursery maid of the family, who had been brought up all the children seeing the very last, limiting the long-petted Master Harry to send to school after his brothers, was now living in the deserted nursery to mend stockings with the dress of all blains and bruises he could get near her, and who was consequently only too happy in being allowed to go, and her dear Miss Louisa vague wishes were Sarah thither, and occurred only to Mrs. Mungrove's and Henrietta, but without Anne it would hardly be resolved on, and found it practicable so soon they were in debt. The next day, to Charles Hayter, for all the minute knowledge, was Louisa, and it was so essential to obtain every 24 hours. He made it business to go to Lyme, and with his account, it was still encouraging. The intervals was a sense of consciousness to be stronger. Every report agreed in Captain Wentworth appearing fixed in Lyme. Anne was to leave to them on the morrow at the event which they all dreaded. What should they do without her? Well, the wrenched comforters for one another, and so much was said in a way that Anne thought she could do no better to impart them in the general inclination which she was privy, and persuaded them all to go at Lyme at once. She had little difficulty, and soon determined that they would go to-morrow, and fix themselves at the inn or get into lodgings, as suited, and there better remain dear Louisa, who could be moved. They be deciding taking off some trouble for the good people she was with, and it might at least relieve Miss Harville from the care of her own children. And in short, they were so happy in the decision that Anne was delighted to see what she had done, and felt that she could not spend her last morning at Uppercross better than assisting their preparations of sending them off at the early hour, though her being left to the solitary range of the house was the consequence. She was the last, excepting the little boys at the cottage. She was the very last and only remaining one of all that had filled all that animated both houses, and had been given at Uppercross its cheerful character. A few days made a change indeed. If Louisa recovered, it would all be well again. The more former happiness would be restored. There could not be a doubt to her mind that there was none to follow her recovery. A few months hence, that a room so deserted, occupied by her silent, pensive self, might be filled again with all that was happy and gay. All that was glowing and bright and prosperous love was most unlike Anne Elliot. And that our complete leisure was such reflections for these on a dark November day, and small thick rain was almost blotting out very few objects that ever be discerned from the windows. It was enough to make the sound of Lady Russell's carriage exceedingly welcome, and yet, though desirous to be gone, she could not quit the mansion house, or look adieu to the cottage, with its black and dripping comfortless verandah, or even notice the misty paint misty glasses the last humble tenants of the village. Without the saddened heart, scenes passed in the upper cross and made it precious. It stood the record of many sensations of pain, once severe, but now softened. Some of the instances relenting feelings, some breathings of friendship and reconciliation. It could never be looked for again, and would never cease to be dear. It only left behind her, but the recollections of all the things had been. Anne had never left Kellynch. Since her quitting of Lady Russell's house in September, it had not been necessary, and on a few occasions of it being possible for her to go to the contrive to evade and escape from, her first return was to resume her place in the modern, elegant apartments of the lodge, to gladden her eyes of its mistress. There was some anxiety mixed with Lady Russell's joy in meeting her. She knew who had been frequently Uppercross, but happily either Anne was improved in plumpness or looks, or Lady Russell fancied her so. Anne, receiving a compliment on the occasion, had the amusement of connecting with them in the silent admiration of her cousin, and hoping that she was to be blessed with a second spring of youth and beauty. When they came to converse, she was soon so sensible of mental change. The subject of her heart had been full on leaving Kellynch, in which she had felt slightly, and the compelled to smother the Musgroves were now become of secondary interest. She had lost sight of even her father and sister at Bath, and their concerns had been sunk under those of Uppercross, and when Lady Russell reverted to the former hopes and fears of her satisfaction in the house in Camden Place which had been taken, her regret was much that Clay should be with them, and Anne should be ashamed to have it known so much more that she was thinking of Lyman Louisa Musgrove and all their acquaintances there, how much more interesting it was her to be a home friendship of the Harvilles and Captain Benwick than of her own father's house in Camden Place, and her own sister's intimacy with Mrs. Clay. She was actually forced to exert herself to meet Lady Russell with anything like the appearance of equal solitude, or on the topics of nature first claim on her. There was a little awkwardness at first in their discourse, but on another subject they must speak of the accident at Lyme. Lady Russell had not arrived 5 minutes the day worth before the full account of the whole had bursted on her. But it must still be talked of in making inquiries, and she must regret the imprudence. The lament the result, and Captain Wentworth's name must be mentioned. Anne was cautious of not doing it well with Lady Russell. She could not speak the name, and looked straight forward into Lady Russell's eye, till she adopted the expedient of telling him briefly what she thought of the attachment between him and Louisa. When this was told, his name was distressed no longer. But Lady Russell only listened to composedly and wished them happy, but internally her heart revelled in angry pleasure, in complete contempt, that the man who at 23 had seemed to understand somewhat value of the Anne Elliot, soon 8 years afterwards be charmed by a Louisa Musgrove. But the first 3 or 4 days passed most quietly, with no circumstances to mark them at the receipt of the note from Tower Lyme, and found their way to Anne, she could not tell how, by the rather improving account of Louisa. At the end of that period, Lady Russell's politeness could repose no longer, and that the fainter self-threatening of the past became in a decided tone. I must call on Mrs Croft. I really must call upon her soon. And you have the courage to go with me and pay a visit to that house? It will be some trial to both of us. I did not shrink from it. On the contrary, she truly felt said in observing, I think you are very likely to suffer from the most of the two. Your feelings are less reconciled to the change than mine. By the remaining in the neighbourhood, I am to be inured by it. She could have said more on the subject, and for in fact such a high opinion of the Crofts, and considered her father very fortunate of its tenants, felt the parish to be so sure of the good example and poor of the attention of her leaf, that however sorry and ashamed for the necessity of removal, she could not but in conscience feel that they were gone who they deserved not to stay. And at Kellynch Hall had passed into better hands than its owners, and these convictions had been unquestionably had their own pay, and severe was its kind, but they preluded that the pain which Lady Russell would suffer in entering the house again, and returning the well-known apartments. in such a moment that Anne had no power of saying to herself, they had, they had these rooms ought to belong only to us. How fallen in their destinations, how unworthily occupied, an ancient family so driven away, strangers filling their place. No, except what she thought of her mother, and remember what she had been used to sit and preside. She had no sign of the description to heave. Mrs. Croft only said with kindness and the pleasure with fancying herself to a favourite, and on the present occasion receiving her in a house that was in the most attention. The that sad accident at Lyme was soon the prevailing topic, and on the comparing the latest accounts of the invalid, in which each lady dated their intelligence for the same hour of the yestern morn, and Captain Wentworth had been in Kellynch yesterday, and for the first time since the accident had brought Anne on the last note, and she had not been able to retrace the exact steps of had the stayed hours in been returned to Lyme again, and without any present intentions of quitting it any more, she had inquired after. She found, particularly, that this expressed his hope of Miss Elliot's not being worse for their exertions, and spoke of those exertions as great. This was handsome, and gave her the more pleasure than anything could have been done. As to the sad catastrophe itself, it might be canvassed to only one in style in the couple of steady, sensible women whose judgment had to work on ascertained events. It was perfectly decided, and its consequence was much thoughtlessness and imprudence. Its effect was most alarming and frightful to think. How long Miss Munro's recovery might be yet doubtful, how liable she must remain to suffer from the concussion thereafter. The Admiral would round it up summarily by exclaiming, a very bad business indeed, in this new sort of way for a young fellow making love by breaking his mistress' heads, is not, Miss Elliot? In breaking a head, giving it plaster, truly. Admiral Croft's manners were not so of the Lady Russell's, but they delighted Anne, for the goodness of his heart and simplicity of character were irresistible. "Now this may be very bad for you," he said, suddenly rousing from a little reverie, "and to be coming to find us here. I had not recollected it here before, but I declare it must be very bad. But now, please do not stamp upon ceremony. Get up and go all the rooms in the house if you like. Another time, sir. Thank you, not now. Whenever it suits you. You can slip up in the shrubbery any time, and there you find we keep umbrellas hanging up on the door. Good place, is it not? But," checking himself, "you have not think a good place where yours could be kept in the butler's room. Ay, so it is, I believe. One man's ways could only be good as another. But we like our own best, and if you not, and you must judge yourself, it would be better for you to go about the house or not." And, finding that she might decline it, did so very gracefully. "We have made a few changes either," continued the Admiral, after thinking a moment. "Very few. We told you the laundry door at Uppercross. There had been a very great improvement. That the wonder was, at any neighbourhood on earth could bear with the inconvenience of its opening as it did. So long! You will tell Sir Walter what we have done, and Mr. Sefford would think it greatest improvement upon the house ever had. Indeed, I must do it ourselves, justice to say that a few alterations that we have been very much for the better. My wife would have credited for them, however. I've done very little besides sending away some of the large looking glasses of my dressing room, which was your father's, a very good man, and the very much gentleman, I am sure, but I should think, Miss Elliot, with a very serious looking reflection, that I think he must be a rather dressy man for his time of his life. Such a number of looking glasses. Oh Lord, there was no getting away from oneself. So I got Sophie to lend me a hand as soon as we shifted their quarters. I'm now quite snug, with the little shaving glasses on one corner, and another great thing that shall never go near." Anne, amused in spite of herself, was rather distressed for an answer that the Admiral, feeling he had not been civil enough, took up a subject again to say, "The next time you write to your good father, Miss Elliot, pray him to give him my compliments and Mrs Croft's, that we are settled here for quite our liking, and no fault to find it along with the place. The breakfast-room chimney smokes a little, I grant you, but it will be only when the wind is due north and blows hard. There will not be 3 times a winter, and take it altogether, that we have been into the most of the houses hereabouts can judge. There's not one that we like better than this, and pray so, with my compliments. He will be glad to hear it. Lady Russell and Mrs Croft were very pleased with each other, but the acquaintance which this visit was began faded not to proceed far at present, for when it was returned, the Crofts announced themselves to be going away for a few weeks, for their connections in the north of the country, and probably might be not home again for before Lady Russell would be removing to Bath. So ended all danger to Anne of meeting Captain Wentworth at Kellynch Hall, and of seeing him in company with her friend. Everything was safe enough, and she smiled over the many anxious feelings that she had wasted on the subject.